Fundamentally, you need hydrogen, like ammonia production. You know, it matters not about batteries, we're going to need hydrogen.
Hydrogen is often talked about as a future fuel, but discussions about its practicality in specific industries is rarer. Today we're talking to Harvey Hodd, CEO of Rivan, to discuss where it works, where it doesn't, and why it's still dividing opinion.
I'm Harvey Hodd, I'm the founder and CEO of Rivan. I lead a lot of the engineering here, and we're a synthetic fuel manufacturer. Basically, we build the systems that make various types of synthetic fuels. We're starting with natural gas. Hydrogen is incredibly energy dense, firstly. So we're talking maybe 3 times-ish more than traditional fuels. So just on that level, really good energy source, and also has no CO2 in its combustion. Excellent. I think really though, when you then look at applications, it has to displace fuels, and there's really 2 options in those areas. So areas that can be electrified and areas that can't be electrified I think are 2 key areas. So for example, why we focus on the latter, that cannot be electrified, is because it doesn't really matter about batteries and things like that. You fundamentally need a molecule. Whereas areas that can be electrified, you're then in this battle between hydrogen and electrification. And then really, I think you've got to look at not only just the utility of that molecule, and we can talk about that, but also what are you actually fighting against? You're fighting against the learning rate of batteries, which is incredible. You know, batteries in the last month have probably decreased by a specific percent. They would have had to. It's up there with one of the best learning rates there is. It's close-ish to solar, not quite, because it's slightly more complex to produce, and solar is the epitome of a learning rate because of modularity. It's just ease. It's got very few materials. It has no moving parts, things like that. And then really, therefore, it's hydrogen versus batteries. And in my mind, most of the applications that hydrogen is being touted as a solution for actually should be electrified, because it's more efficient. To produce hydrogen, you need a vast amount of electricity. You might as well just directly electrify. And then also, you're having to retrofit a lot of things. So I think you touched on it, but the complexities and the thermodynamic challenges, which ultimately is just a cost question in the liquefaction, in the storage and the distribution of hydrogen, I think makes it very difficult for anything where a battery is an alternative. And I think then you'd ultimately look at what is the learning rate of hydrogen. It's actually not particularly good, and then you're fighting the tide. And I think what often the discourse is around is shoehorning a molecule like hydrogen into an application and trying to find a home, where actually you can electrify just as well. And I think you've probably seen that with Tesla, for example, in just how quickly they can induce a learning rate and drive down the costs of EVs. I think you're now seeing that in heating and various other applications. So I think I therefore find it challenging to go against, it's incredibly challenging to go against the learning rate. And I think as such, I think shoehorning hydrogen into some of these applications is just fundamentally incorrect. It's also, as a result, financially not very viable. And that's what we've seen as a result from funding being pulled, and it's almost like we're trying to find a solution is trying to find a home, and I'm not really sure that's the best way. HEVs maybe are a good example though for batteries again. So anything that is heavy and needs to stick to the ground and doesn't need to fly, batteries will take over, because yeah, they might be slightly heavier, but that doesn't matter when you don't need to fly.
So perhaps hydrogen's challenge isn't potential, it's practicality. We reviewed footage from our other hydrogen experts, Ulemco's Amanda Line and River Simple's Hugo Spowers, to remind ourselves of their views.
Transport is hard to decarbonise, full stop. The opportunity for hydrogen is it better matches what you currently do today. The idea with a truck having to charge, well, imagine the battery pack that you're actually putting in to make a truck in comparison to your passenger car. You're talking about hours of charging, and while you're doing that, the vehicle's not productive.
There is a mantra going around that we need hydrogen for HGVs because they're large. It's absolutely the right conclusion. We do need hydrogen for HGVs, but it's got nothing to do with size. It's for completely the wrong reason that we reach that conclusion. And there's 2 ways we can illustrate that. First of all, it's easy to make a battery electric HGV if you're happy to do 50 miles a day, but that's not what HGVs do. It's the range and the uptime that means we need hydrogen.
There's probably an argument, I'm ignorant to what the distribution looks like over there, but if you have some level of distribution and incentivization and funding to create the infrastructure that carries hydrogen to those applications, maybe you can make that work. I think where it really works is where fundamentally you need hydrogen, like ammonia production. You know, it matters not about batteries, we're going to need hydrogen. So I think in those areas, yeah, of course, hydrogen is going to be the only option. I just find it very challenging. Again, back to that argument, even if the infrastructure is in place, even if we had hydrogen fueling systems around here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean we should be using them for cars. It would still be vastly more expensive than just putting a battery in a car. So it's like, again, we're trying to shoehorn it. Maybe it's a good stepping stone potentially, but that would only be the case if batteries were too expensive and they're not. So I basically, again, goes back to, if you're up against the learning rate of batteries, it can't work, and nor should it, just from it's just cheaper and cleaner in many ways than hydrogen. It should really only be used in areas that you cannot electrify, and that's where we're really focused on synthetic fuels, for example.
It's clear that Harvey believes the real fuel efficiencies lay in competing technologies that have already proved themselves.
I think in that respect, synthetic fuels will always be or have a CO2 intensity relative to hydrogen. I think that makes complete sense. However, the key difference I would say today is that they can be used today. You know, as in, if we produce 500 gigawatt hours today on one of our sites, we could go and decarbonize the steel production in a huge factory, for example. Like today, there's no distribution change, there's no utilization change, it's a drop-in replacement. And I think there's a real importance to making change today and not having this, oh yeah, you know, this might have an effect in a decade, or we're gonna have to spend billions on infrastructure. The reason that hasn't happened is because who's paying for this? You know, ultimately it's, you know, the steelworks that need these fuels. Are they paying for it? Well, no, they don't have the margin, nor are they incentivized. So I think where we've really looked at this is, where can we have an impact today? I think it's very difficult to suggest that with hydrogen, for example, because again, we don't have the infrastructure. It would be amazing if we did. It would be great and it would be beneficial to everybody. Still doesn't mean it would be batteries in areas that you can electrify, but it would be net positive for the world if we had that infrastructure, but we don't. And then the lastly on batteries, I think just the cost, but it trades off a little on energy density. So for example, you don't have batteries in long haul aviation because the weight that would be required, it would be too heavy to get that plane off the ground and fly to, you know, from the UK to Los Angeles or something like that. That's where kerosene as a fuel has such incredibly vast energy density relative to a battery. That's why we need it. So I think really from my standpoint is that I think everything will be electrified rapidly via solar and batteries because of their vast learning rates, other than the industries that you fundamentally cannot, which are those, you know, long-haul aviation, steel, cement, chemicals. I see very little place for hydrogen as a singular molecule other than a feedstock to create synthetic fuels that are a drop-in replacement for current infrastructure. We came into this because with this belief that 20% of the world's energy cannot be electrified at all. So there's this amazing learning rate with batteries, where batteries are, and the learning rate being that for every doubling of capacity of production, you get a set percentage drop of price. So why solar panels are so cheap today is because they have an amazing learning rate. Same with batteries, getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, meaning more and more applications can be electrified. So like cars are a great example. But then there are these nasty areas, quote unquote nasty areas, that it doesn't matter how good batteries become, you need fuels. If you think about any normal fuels, take natural gas. Natural gas is the most kind of ubiquitous fuel. It's used in so many different applications. Heating and transport and industrial heat and things like that. Now, ultimately, we rip that out of the ground and then we burn it and it combusts and has CO2 that gets put into the air and heat as a byproduct almost. And this creates this kind of fairly vicious, not even cycle, because it's not really a loop, but we're basically constantly adding to a net increase of CO2 in the air. Now, our aim was saying, well, actually, the actual molecule, like natural gas, for example, is fairly easy to make synthetically. So as long as you've got hydrogen and CO2 as molecules, synthesize those together in a reactor, you can actually, like chemically identical, make the exact same thing, but without ripping it out of the ground. Because H2 and CO2, you can pull CO2 from the air, you can create H2 from water. They're thermodynamically challenging, meaning you need a vast amount of energy to do so, but they're actually fairly very well understood processes. Once you combine those, you can have the same chemical, so same natural gas or kerosene or methanol or something like that, but without needing to rip it out of the ground. So for every kind of cubic meter or kilo of synthetic fuels that you produce, you're essentially displacing the need to rip more out of the ground of a fossil-derived source. The main challenge has always been, how do you do that cheaply? If you do that cheaply, there'll be no need to drill for the world's resource. Just absolutely no need. The challenge is how do you do it cheaply? First and foremost, synthetic fuels have always been expensive. And fundamentally because splitting water into hydrogen is very thermodynamically challenging, and capturing CO2 from the air at 400 ppm is very challenging because you need vast amounts of airflow and you often need to heat it or have huge pressure to then reuse that CO2 molecule. Both of which, regardless of what anyone does ever, will be thermodynamically challenging. Just like the equilibrium points are really, really high. Our approach is that actually, if the energy required is really high, it's really a factor of how cheap is the input energy, how cheap is the electricity, the electron that's coming in. And we now live in a time, very serendipitously, where solar energy is the cheapest electron source in history by a long shot, where you can fairly easily now get between £5 and £10 a megawatt hour DC electricity via solar, which is an order or two orders of magnitude cheaper than retail electricity, what people have in their homes. Which is, using that drop, you can start to use vast amounts of energy and still have an output that's very cheap. So basically our take on this is, if you have very, very, very cheap input electricity, first time in history it could have been done in the last few years, and also you vertically integrate all the engineering, so you strip out all of these like massive costs for reactors and we make everything ourselves. If you combine those two, in theory you can make very, very cheap synthetic fuels. Before even thinking about creating synthetic fuels, I was basically looking at what are the problems that are worth really trying to solve, that are critical, that aren't really moving currently and needed an injection of capital or resource or engineering or just obscene focus over a long period of time. I looked at lots of things, but really came down to carbon in the air. I think that is is why we're talking about hydrogen right now. It underlies pretty much everything. And I really came to the conclusion that carbon capturing as a whole it's too expensive today. That's why it's in the air. And the reason it's too expensive is a couple of factors. Number one is carbon dioxide is actually not an extremely valuable molecule. If it was really valuable in the air, we would mine the sky. People would make money that way. And number two is carbon capturing. If you sell the credits, it's not a free market, meaning you don't have free market dynamics, which are the things that drive the cost of something lower, like a learning rate again. And therefore, the biggest banks in the world aren't going to put enough money into it because it's too risky. So you don't get all of this R&D funding, all of this liquidity, which is really critical to drive down the cost of something. And the last core tenet there is, as a result of those two things, you never really drive down the cost of something enough. And I thought that was happening in CO2 and specifically in DAC, direct air capture. Actually, we are it's not an argument that we need to capture it. It's going to happen, or it needs to happen rather. But maybe we think about it slightly differently. And our hypothesis was that if you take that CO2 molecule and instead of trying to sell that as a credit or something like that, you would valorize it basically and create a more valuable gross end product, which we thought fuels were a great example for that. And then you would basically create a profit-bearing mechanism to capture carbon from the air and sell it into a vast liquid market, which is fuels, and it really has this kind of utility in the world today. You have a drop-in replacement for all these industrial processes, and you have supply chains and distribution. It's all there. You have project finance and everything. And really, that's how we kind of came into it. And our thought there is, synthetic fuels, again, aren't new. It's very hard to make cheaply. And again, the last core area would being that I think for the first time in history, you can actually start to make synthetic fuels cheaply because the electrical input costs have now finally reached a point with solar that it's economically viable to do so. So that was the cascade to basically capture vast amounts of carbon via synthetic fuels and do so because of cheap electricity.
Maybe hydrogen isn't a universal replacement at the moment, but a specialist solution. And while the future's uncertain, what is certain is that hydrogen has its place. We just need to find it.